Greetings and welcome back to the Casual Wargamer. You join me on a warm summer's evening, cooling down with my usual hot chocolate. And today we're going to talk Space Marines. Space Marines. So this goes back to 9-year-old me. Who at the time had learnt of Dungeons and Dragons and really wanted to play that. But being 9, you've got no way of doing it. And it wasn't until I hit my teens in, I was about to say high school, which is what I always say, but we called them secondary schools over here, when I met somebody who was also into role-playing. Not so much the D&D, more Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. He got me into Games Workshop stuff. And in order to play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I started buying White Dwarf magazine about the same time that they started to preview Rogue Trader. So we're talking sort of like early 87, I guess, or early to mid 87. And I loved the concept of the setting for it. It sort of blew my teenage mind away. But the thing that really grasped me was Space Marines. Of all the things they showcased, this really struck my noggin. And this love of that particular army has lasted nearly 40 years now. Although I have been almost entirely loyal, there have been a few instances where I didn't play Space Marines. But we'll come to that another time. So, Space Marines in Rogue Trader were a little bit different than they were now. The Rogue Trader universe was relatively different to what we know from what has expanded. They were still genetically engineered super soldiers. They were just a little bit more psycho-indoctrinated nut jobs. They were a lot more crazies, I think, is really how Rogue Trader sort of put them. They've toned that down a lot as the editions have gone along, and now they're just, fanatically loyal and what have you. But there's always something about that, concept. I think it's not just the physical engineering; it was the it was the psychological engineering that really made them such a threat. And I think the way they were presented for teenage me, they sort of like probably represented my first sort of hint at, sort of like fantasized masculinity. They were. They were the sort of things that, got the heart pounding sort of thing, thinking about, these sort of fights and action movies and all sorts. And I think that's partly what sort of got me at the time. And so when Rogue Trader was released in October 87, my friend Chris and I went down to Games Day and picked up my copy. I also picked up the plastic Space Marine box that they had and the metal Orc box. And I'll talk about the Orc box when we come to the Orc video. And I started buying the metal models to go with it. They were sort of like this. I'm not sure really what they were. Sometimes people say they were lead. Sometimes they say they were something else. But the metal miniatures. And quite frankly, by today's standards, they were awful. I always have this rose-tinted glasses sort of mindset of the old metal models. But they were awful, really. I talk about modern models from Games Workshop being far too detailed. There's far too much business going on these guys, really. But the old ones, there was nothing. You had, almost like smooth armor and guns and what have you. They were much simpler to paint, but there wasn't a lot going on. They didn't really stand out. But in my mind, I remember one model that for some reason I absolutely fell in love with, which was a beaky Marine holding a multi-melter, sort of aiming it down to the ground and looking sort of like down the length of the barrel. Goodness knows what he was meant to be doing with it, but there you go. But in my mind, that was a beautiful model until you see it many years later and go, what was I thinking? And I could never really decide what to paint them as. I ended up painting them as Ultramarines, Blood Angels, Silver Skulls. I went through a few. And we only really played Rogue Trader a few times, if I'm honest, probably about a dozen or so times between 87 and probably 90 when we sort of left school. But I read through it constantly, reading and stuff, and what have you. Over time, Space Marines have changed. As I say, they're no longer quite the psychotic nutters that they were presented in Rogue Trader. And the universe expanded, and with them, the lore on Space Marines, until we get to the present day where we have Primaris Marines. And I know some people really don't like Primaris, and I personally, I don't get that hate and loathing. Some people go, it doesn't fit the lore. Well, actually, it does fit the lore really, really well. Some people just don't like the idea that Call and his Mechanicus buddies have improved upon the Emperor's work, but they've had 10,000 years to do it. Let's be honest. They're going to make some progress, especially if Gilliman has told them, hey, press the buttons that you're not meant to press and, do what you've got to do. The problem with Space Marines in previous editions, and you'll know, I come back to this quite often in my videos. I talk about the old style AP system, where if you had, say, I'm going to use AP3 as an example, if the target was a armor saving throw of 3, 4, 5, or 6, they didn't get a save. And because of that, everybody would load up on AP3 weapons, because half the armies in the game were AP3, which meant you pretty much guaranteed of denying your opponent an armor save. And because of that, through until the release of 8th edition, when the AP system started to change, Space Marines, in my opinion, were overcosted, because you were basically paying for an armor save you weren't getting enough of the time. If memory serves me right, Marines were coming in at about 16 points a model, and they should have been 12, let's be honest. It would have given you those few extra bodies here and there which would soak up the hits. Now with an AP system going back to how Rogue Trader did it, which is a penalty to your armor save, Marines are a lot more sustainable, and so I think the points are much more appropriate to them. The problem you have now with Marines, and this is Games Workshop's fault, is they've kind of, we knew from the moment Primaris were introduced that you were going to lose Firstborn. And I hate that term. I don't even know that that's an official Games Workshop designation for the original Marines, or whether that's just a fan community one. But I don't know, it just doesn't suit me, Firstborn. But anyway, we knew that Firstborn were going to go the moment Primaris were introduced, because you can't expand the Space Marine range that much. And what they've done is they've given us cool things like these guys, aggressors, and what have you. But everything else has now become too specialised. Somebody put it to me a while back, and I think they're right, that they've basically gone back to Horus Heresy, which tends to have a unit for a purpose. And so now, if you want multi-melters, you take Eradicators. If you want snipers, you take Eliminators. If you want plasma, you take Hellblasters. If you want missile launchers, you take Desolators. And in a way, it's kind of thematic, and it's maybe the sort of thing I can see Marines doing. The problem is, it makes it, I think, and please disagree with me if you're a fellow Space Marine player, it makes it difficult for list building. Because for a good while in 10th, I stopped bothering with Eradicators. It's only the last couple of months or so I've started digging them out of the cupboard again. This cupboard you can see behind me. Because, quite frankly, I would bring them to a game and find that my opponent has one tank and loads of infantry. At which point, my Eradicators are almost pointless. Because if I never get near that tank, I'm potentially killing a couple of models a turn with them. And that's it. It's not like intercessors or heavy intercessors who can gun down a number of lightly armoured targets relatively easily. And likewise, if I end up taking a lot of anti-tank and running into that, I have that problem. If I run a lot of anti-infantry stuff, and I did that at one of our local tournaments a few months back, everyone was running infantry. There was very little in the way of mechanised or vehicles. And the one time I turned up with an infantry heavy list, it was all vehicles and walkers, and I was screwed. Deep breath. So I think there is a slight problem in that it makes it, you've really got to think about what you want your list to do. And I think for Marines, it means that you can end up with a list that is subpar to what you face, which is a little bit irritating. All in all, however, I think Space Marines are in a good place from where they've been for many years. I do think that the current codex is very playable. It just suffers a little bit like Tyranids in being very average because of how its units are laid out. The problem with Space Marines is they are a jack of all trades, master of none army. They have the ability to do a little bit of everything. They can shoot reasonably well. They can fight okay. They've got options to run around the table and do things, but they're generally not very good at any of it. Other armies, I tend to find, outmaneuver them, outshoot them, outfight them. And it kind of makes Space Marines feel a little bit underwhelming. It's frustrating, if I'm very honest. But let's take a look at the codex. That's my thoughts in general on Space Marines. With the current codex, you have a very nice army rule. We have O's of Moment. In the original data slates that came with the release of 10th, this gave you picked a target in your command phase, and it gave you rerolls to hit and rerolls to wound. A lot of people went, it's too good. And it's like, you're saying that because you don't play Space Marines. As a Space Marine player, that was a godsend, or Emperor Send, however you want to say it. It was brilliant. It really helped. Come the Codex and Games Workshop have gone, screw you, you can have it on the hit roll, not the wound. Marines don't need a re-roll to hit. Marines hit very well. 3-up ballistic skill is fine. And I was very disappointed that the recent June update did not fix this. Games Workshop, if you are listening, this needs to be re-roll the wound roll. We struggle to wound things. You've made anti-vehicle weapons like melters wound on 5s. You've made orcs toughness 5, so it's harder for us to actually wound a lot of stuff that comes to the table. This needs a change. Rant over. That's our army roll. And yeah, it's nice, but it needs that change. You then got a series of detachments. And I've got to be honest, I'm not a big fan of these. I think instead of making them how an army fights, which should be what they're based on, they're based on the chapters because they can't be bothered to work out how to balance Legion Progenitor chapter rules. The first one you've got is the Gladius Task Force, which is your generic one that came in the data slate. And actually, like I say in probably nearly every codex, this default detachment is arguably the best one in the book. So this gives you your doctrines, your Devastator, Tactical, and Assault doctrines. And you get to pick one of these once per game, unless you've got something special that you do it again, like a stratagem or something. And they are handy. You've got some reasonable enhancements for it. But if I'm honest, the stratagems aren't very good. Every single detachment Space Marines get has Armour of Contempt, that's fine. But when I play this detachment, and I come back to it quite a bit lately, I rarely bother with the stratagems, and I end up playing just the ones from the core rulebook, because they're not great for this. They tend to rely too much on not so much specific parts of the game, but I only really want this detachment for the doctrines, and these don't do anything to really help me, I find, in games. I've played it a fair bit, and I rarely ever end up needing these. Other than Armour Contempt, I think Adaptive Strategy has helped me a couple of times, but I've never used Honour the Chapter. I've rarely used Squad Tactics, and so on. They're not great. Anvil Siege Force is the Imperial Fist one. I tend to play this more often than not because my chapter is the Imperial Fist successor. And I do it for thematic narrative reasons. It has a massive flaw. It's a nice detachment because it gives all your ranged weaponry heavy, and if you're already heavy, if you stand still, you get +1 to the wound roll. At first glance, you go, oh, this is really good. And then you realise that 10th edition is a game where you have to run around the table and not stand still. So you rarely ever get this ability unless it's right at the beginning of the game, maybe. After that, it's fairly pointless. And I tend to use it more for vehicles, for the ballistas, the Spartan, and things like that, where I can sit there and go, right, I'm hitting on 2s, and usually it's at the O's of moment target, so I'm re-rolling the 1s. This is a nice ability, though, if you can get it to work. Your enhancements are okay with the exception of Fleet Commander, which is quite frankly terrible. Games Workshop have never managed to get an orbital bombardment ability to work right in this game, and this is no different. Whenever you have an ability like this, especially when it's a once per game effect, if you give your opponent the opportunity to move away from the point where you're going to use it, it's a waste of points. Why would you ever do it? I think I've taken it once, and that's only because I had 15 points spare and nothing else, and it never got used. Stratagem-wise, unlike the Gladius Task Force, where I use it for the ability, not the stratagems, this is one where I use for the stratagems. The stratagems rock socks when you play a shooty marine army. My only issue is you need to ditch one of these. I would get rid of Rigid Discipline. I've never used that. I've never seen anybody use that. And in its place, I would give a stratagem for 1 CP that says a Astartes unit in your army when it shoots, it counts as stationary even if it moved or advanced. Suddenly, you're getting the ability of your detachment on a unit you've managed to get into the right place. Why Games Workshop never gave us that stratagem, came up with that stratagem, or if they did, they didn't put it in the book, I don't know. It would be a must for this detachment to make it work. Next up is the Ironstorm Spearhead, which recently got a little bit of a nerf. This is your Iron Hands detachment. It's based around vehicles. And although it's based around vehicles, I say that, mostly I see people using it for dreadnoughts. I myself used it at one of our local tournaments and a couple other friendly games, and it was all based around a Tech Marine, this guy who I still haven't finished painting, with 2 Redemptors and a Brutalis. Brutalis runs off causing mischief and annoyance, and this guy stands next to 2 Dreadnoughts and basically goes, yeah, come on. The detachment rule is Armored Wrath, which once per phase, for each start unit in your army, you can re-roll 1 hit roll, 1 wound roll, or 1 damage roll for a model in that unit. That is awesome. It really is. Each unit gets this benefit. They pick one of those rolls, but they each get it. That's phenomenal. If that had been for the Anvil Siege Force, that would have been even better. So yeah, I think a lot of people were kind of. I was about to say abusing this detachment. I don't think that's the right thing, but I think people were overdoing it. They found one that really worked with the current blandness or averageness of the Space Marine Codex, and Games Workshop have looked at it and gone, "Not going to let you do that." It probably needed it, to be fair. So it's now the I think, if I remember correctly, it was the uh, the target augury web, if I remember correctly. So instead of being a aura effect for the Tech Marine to basically benefit a unit, it's one unit. I think that's the right one. Yeah. To be honest, I enjoyed it the couple of times that I played it. Well, I say a couple of times, the few times I played it, but it isn't one I would come back to. The Firestorm Assault Detachment is your Salamanders list, your detachment, and this gives all your ranged weapons assault. And if they shoot at a target within 12 inches, they get +1 to the strength of the attack. I've played this once and I found it really underwhelming. What people will disagree with me on this, but what this needed to be is that ranged weapons gain the assault ability, and if you target a unit within 12 inches, you increase the AP of your weapons by 1. Suddenly, everyone goes, no, because that would make flamers incredibly powerful. No, it wouldn't. Flamers are AP 0 for the most part, unless you've got something wiggy going on. Making, and things like Infernus Marines and Pyroblasters, obviously, yeah, it's weight of dice that do it, but this is the detachment to do that with, then this detachment suddenly becomes quite good. Right now, I was not impressed. I don't want to be within 12 inches of an enemy unit. I want them dead from a distance. I want to gunline them almost before they get anywhere near me, before they get onto an objective. I wasn't impressed. I appreciate that there are people who like this one, but I was not overly fond of it. And I'm not overly fond of the stratagems for it either. Now we come to the Stormlance Detached Task Force detachment, which is one that I am really disappointed with. This is your White Scars detachment, and it basically goes that all the Astartes units from your army are eligible to declare a charge in a turn in which they advanced or fell back. Okay, yeah, that's cool. That's really nice. You look at this and you go, this is for my close combat Marines. And then you go, well, what's the enhancements I've got? Give this to a mounted model. Okay, give this to a mounted model. And the other two are fine. So 2 of them have to be mounted. Then you look at the stratagems. Okay, we've got armor contempt. You have to pause me. I'm looking at this over my phone. Armor contempt, yeah. Blazing Fusillade. Okay, yeah, that's nice. That's for shooty. Full throttle, a mounted or vehicle unit, excluding walkers. Okay. Shock assault, a mounted unit. Okay. Ride hard, ride fast, a mounted unit or fly vehicle. Wind swift evasion. Okay, 1 enemy unit within 9 inches. Great. It's all about mounted units. Who does this benefit? Space Wolves. Because Outriders are your mounted units in the Space Marine Codex, and they're crap. Let's be honest. Outriders are naff right now. Excuse me. This, instead of trying to emulate White Scars, this detachment should have been about assault marines, assault intercessors, jump pack assault intercessors, blade guard, assault terminators. This should have been about your units that get to run in and smack the enemy down. Instead, they've made it about pointless outriders. As I say, the only Space Marine force that benefits from this detachment is Space Wolves, because Thunderwolf Cavalry are awesome. Let's have, the only way you're going to fix this really is if they do an update or the next codex rolls around, and assuming they don't change these sort of detachments, you allow them, even if it's just a sergeant, to take something like a power fist or a thunder hammer or something that isn't a poxy, bloody, pointless chainsword. It's a disappointment. I played it once and went never again. It's useless, really useless. Sorry, Waste Class players. The Vanguard Spearhead is your Raven Guard detachment, and it's all about Phobos and infiltrators. And so your main ability is Shadow Masters. Each time a ranged attack targets a unit from your army, unless the attacker is within 12, they get -1 to hit and you get cover. That's really nice. And it's got some nice enhancements. The main one, the good 25.1, is the Blade Driven Deep, which you put on an infantry character, and while they're leading a unit, that unit has infiltrators. That's awesome sauce. I stick this on a Gravis captain, put him with 6 aggressors, and start him halfway up the table. I've used this to good effect before. It's the one time that I have defeated Tau before the new codex. It was in the data slates under 10th, because I was up there straight away and was able to just charge straight into 2 of his main units and beat them to death with power fists. You don't need... The nice thing about this detachment is you don't need to be playing Phobos or Scouts to benefit from it. You can actually do this very well with anything else. And the enhancements work really well. You've got stuff that is only for Phobos and Scouts, obviously, or they get a better benefit, I should say. And this is probably the closest you get to some sort of close combat, because you can get up there easily enough and then smack and do things in the charge phase and so forth. So yeah, I'd say it's one of the better ones, but it works better. It's about the only time I know people, Space Marine players out there, seem to love Scouts. I think Scouts are terrible. I think they're pants. But that detachment, they work really, really well. That is the one where you can play them to your heart's content. Then you get the final one, which is the First Company Task Force, which I have yet to play because I haven't got enough Terminators. I've got 2 sets of the 5-man squads from Leviathan, and I've only built and painted one of them. And I haven't built the Stern Guard from those 2 boxes either yet. I know. So I haven't played this. And I think it's the only one I haven't played against from the Space Marine Codex. But I don't like it. Reading through it, it's too restrictive. 10th edition works really well at the 2K point. I do end up playing a lot of 1K games because that's what we can fit in our local store for the tournaments and so on. And I think this only really works in a smaller point game like that. So the detachment rule, and this is why I'll explain why. Extremis level threat, once per battle. This is the key term. In your command phase, you can use this ability. Until you do, each time a model from your army with the Oath of Moment makes an attack that targets your Oath of Moment target, you can re-roll the wound roll. Great. Once per battle. That's pointless. A detachment rule should not be once per battle. It should be 1 unit per phase, per battle round, rather. Not phase, that'd be a bit weird. It needs to be, if you're going to have this and not change over the moment itself, this needs to be once per battle round. The enhancements you've got, let's have a look. Imperium Sword, once per battle. You can add 1 to the attack characteristics of the various melee weapons, and they get that anyway, but then once per battle, start of any phase, if they do, they add 1 to the attack characteristics of melee weapons equipped by all other models in that unit as well. Okay, yeah. Why not just go everyone in the unit gets +1 attack? It's not going to break the game. And 25 points is a lot of points for something where half the ability is once per battle. Fear Made Manifest. 1 model with an enemy unit is in 6 inches of the bearer. Each time that unit fails a battle shock test, 1 model in that unit is destroyed. Or, once per battle, you can kill D3 units. That's 30 points. I'll give you that one. But it's still a once per battle effect. Rights of War. Improve the objective Terminator character. Improve the objective characteristic by 1. And once per battle, at the start of any phase, you can use this and then add 1 to the OC of all other models in that unit. Why is it once per battle? It really makes no sense. Iron Resolve. The bearer has a feel no pain 5+, and once per battle, everyone in the unit gets to fight. Why is it once per battle? It's pointless. It's utterly pointless. For these points, you should be getting this on that unit. Why isn't it like that? Do that, and this detachment rather, would actually be a lot more playable. The other problem with it is very specific, and I get that. It's all Terminators, Blade Guard, Stern Guard, and Vanguard veterans. There's no point playing anything else. It's going to be very restrictive to the units that you take, which I think is another reason why I've never bothered. Because I'd want to play more than just those. I don't know. I find it one of the least useful just because your enhancements are once per battle effects, and it's too restrictive. If you've played it and you enjoy it, let me know why. One of the reasons I think it works better at low, let's say 1k or maybe 1500, is because it is so based around those specific veteran units that you don't want to take anything else. Kind of what I was saying. That's why I think it's better at low scores. And that is your codex. As I say, we are a jack of all trade, master of none, aren't we? And that's why we don't do amazing. We've got our units too spread. You can't have, say, like, you can't copy like a tactical squad and at 5-man have a special weapon, say a guy with a pyre blaster, and then at 10-man squad take a heavy weapon like a multi-melter or a heavy bolter. Maybe that's something to do for intercessors later on. I don't know. You've got to have a good idea what you're going up against to take what you take. And they need to change Oath of Moment desperately. I think one thing I will say, actually, before we get into this, one really, really, really good change was in the recent June update, they fixed the captain issue. So no more is it you can only, you can only do a battle tactic stratagem for free, of which there weren't enough of them, and it was pretty much always going to be, the same thing every time. It's now you can do any of them, but at -1 CP. So for most, it's going to cost you nothing. But the really powerful ones that are like 2 CP, you're still going to have to pay something towards it. And in a game where CP are a resource to manage, it might not always be worth using the big ones. But that's a nice fix. I never got why they made it just battle tactics. So yeah, I'd like to see them improve Space Marines a lot. I think the basic generic Space Marines have always played second fiddle to the like Space Wolves, Blood Angels, Black Templars. The Codex Divergent chapters have always had much better codices. Sorry. They've had much better units. It's almost like, and I've said this many times before to people get into 40k because they see Space Marines. And they go, Space Marines are cool. Now, some people get into Tyranids, some people get into like Chaos Marines or whatever, and some people might get into like Necrons and that. But generally, my experience has been people get into the game because they see Space Marines. They go, that's cool. And they get, either they buy the army, or if they're, younger in their teens or whatever, they badger mum and dad and they buy them a starter box or whatever, and they start playing. And after a while, they go, actually, this is really naff. These don't work. They're crap. And they either throw them in a box, gathering dust, or they throw them on eBay, or they jump ship to another army. They like the game, but they want an army that's going to win. And Space Marines have never really been an army that wins. And they, maybe they jump to those Divergent chapters, or maybe they jump to something completely different. But Games Workshop have got their money, and they've got their new money. And that's why they've always been the intro army for 40k. and that's a problem. Anyway, that's my views. I'm a Space Marine player, and that's my thoughts on this. Casual or not, that's how I think Space Marines are right now. They've got a fairly average codex. It's probably one of the best they've had for a very, very, very long time. Quite like the 5th edition codex, I'll be honest. But it needs an overhaul. It really needs a buff. Maybe it's the power creep sort of factor again. You know, they're one of the first codices and they're great out of the gate, and then everybody overruns them. But let me know what you think. Am I right? Am I wrong? If you like those detachments I was dissing, tell me why. I would be interested. Let me know your thoughts on Space Marines, and let's talk Space Marines. In the meantime, please give me a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button. Let's grow the channel, and I'll see you guys in the comments and in the next vid. Until then, take care and good gaming.